As Europe struggles with the arrival of hundreds of thousands of migrants and tensions rising among neighbors and allies, attitudes in Canada and the United States also seem to be heading along very different paths. To explore what's behind divergent attitudes across the 49th parallel, we're joined tonight by Michael Taub, syndicated columnist for Troy Media and a contributor to the Washington Times; Darren Thorne, adjunct professor at Osgoode Hall Law School; Sylvia Miracle, executive director of the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres; and Supriya Dwivedi, national columnist with the Toronto Sun. And it's good to have all of you back here at TVO with us tonight. We're talking about our home in Nativist land, if I can put it that way. So Supriya, start us out here. The term Nativist, which we hear a lot now, particularly in relation to what's going on south of the border. What does it mean? So
it's the notion of favoring politically the established group in any one place. So in Canada, that would mean when Harper in the last federal election talked about old stock Canadians, and we're seeing that increasingly in the U.S. that tends to mean older white males of Anglo-Saxon persuasion.
Certainly south of the border, and Darren, I'll get you to comment on this first as I read this from an issue of the Huffington Post last December. Republican presidential hopeful and real estate mogul Donald Trump is calling for a, quote, total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, following deadly terror attacks involving Islamic extremists in California and France. Last month, Senator Rand Paul, the Republican of Kentucky, one of Trump's then rivals for the GOP presidential nomination, introduced a similar proposal that would prevent refugees from obtaining tourist and immigration visas if they are from one of about 30 countries with, quote, a significant jihadist movement. How surprised do you get when you see this anti-immigration stance coming out of some of the potential candidates for the, I guess, particularly Republican presidential nomination?
Not really surprised at all. I mean, this is something which tends to rear its head in American politics, and frankly in politics all over the world quite often. It's particularly pronounced in this election cycle due to, well, I hate to say his name, Donald Trump. He's really made it the centerpiece of his campaign, and I think he's done so in a way which the Republican establishment is not that pleased with. I mean, they recognize how this plays, but it plays exceptionally well with the base. He's using it very effectively, and frankly, when you look at American society now, coming out of the Obama presidency, where there was a lot of division and there was a lot of this sort of nativist rhetoric all throughout, it makes sense that it would bleed into this campaign. And it also fits with the mood of the times. There's such economic anxiety right now, and I think it's at those times when you tend to see nativism kind of crest. So add all of that to the fact that there are votes to be mined, and it's not a shock at all that it's come into play.
Led me nicely to the next question. Michael, can you tell how much of this that the candidates who practice this, how much of this they really believe and how much of this is simply very politically opportunistic?
Well, look, I mean, politics is obviously part show and part reality, so it's a question of how it sort of balances out. I mean, people have sort of argued, to use the name that Darren doesn't want to talk about, Donald Trump. Some people have said that he's actually sort of building a kind of a character that may not necessarily jibe with what he really actually believes in. In other words, does he really want to build a wall and then sort of add another 10 feet to it because Vicente Fox said something nasty to him? Does he really believe that he can take all Muslims out of the United States until things resolve itself and we can figure out this matter better? Again, part of it is unfortunately the way political candidates address themselves and how they address their support base. He knows that the people who support him, all the new supporters, Reagan Democrats, independent right-wingers, et cetera, they want to hear that sort of language. They want to hear that sort of vibe from their candidate, so he plays it up as much as he possibly can. The real trick is, I mean, not long after he started winning states heavily, he then said, look, I can then become more diplomatic. I can become more of a president, more of a leader.
He said that. He said, I'm actually capable of acting more presidential.
Exactly. So what do you really believe? So what really is the real Donald Trump and what's the phony Donald Trump? And that's unfortunately kind of hard to tell.
His nativism, Sylvia, is getting great cheers at public rallies. It is also provoking some relatively strong reaction. We're going to see from this headline. Sheldon, you want to bring this up? This is a headline from USA Today. Louis C.K., the comedian, writes letter. Trump is Hitler. And there's the cut line underneath. Louis C.K. doesn't joke around when it comes to politics, and on and on. Sylvia, how dangerous do you think this nativism is in the current U.S. political setting?
I think that nativism is severe anywhere it occurs. I think we're looking at it in the context of an electoral process in the United States. You know, there's a part of me, frankly, Steve, that really wants to say, it exists everywhere Indigenous people have lived around the world, and people got on boats, came to our land, and said, hey, it's terras nullius, we're taking over, and here's the rules. And by the way, the rules happen to go through Anglo-Saxon, European descent males. There is a danger, and we live with it all the time. I think the fact that we're seeing it play out in public media is a bit more honest than it occurs in other ways.
More honest, but it's on steroids in the U.S. right now, isn't it?
And I'm not arguing that, and I'm not arguing that it's acceptable. But at least for once in a very long time in a political process in North America, but certainly in the States, people are maybe probably more honest. I mean, I understand your comments about you know, it's not the real them.
Sure.
My worry is that that is the real them, and what we have seen so far isn't.
It doesn't really matter if that's the real them or not. At the end of the day, if you're stoking and exploiting an undercurrent of fear and Islamophobia and, you know, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-refugee sentiment, I don't think it really matters whether you believe it in or not. The fact is Donald Trump didn't create this sort of nativism. He's just simply exploiting it. And the fact that he is exploiting it and using it to his advantage and having protesters kicked out of rally now, you know, not necessarily inciting other people to violence, but definitely not discouraging it in any way, I think is really frightening. And I think for the first time, you're hearing different conversations between people of color and between white people. And for the first time in a long time, I think white people on a larger scale are looking at Donald Trump and going, oh, okay, so it's not just fun and games. It's actually dangerous now that people are getting hurt, and this rhetoric has now reached an all-time kind of pinnacle of just ridiculousness.
Darren, though, I mean, the one thing they say about politics, don't ever play the Hitler card. Once you play the Hitler card, that's too much.
Or the David Duke card as well.
Well, and that card's been played. So has Louis C.K. gone too far playing the Hitler card?
Well, I mean, Louis C.K. is a comedian, so he can go as far as he really wants to go. I mean, it is something to tag someone with that, but I think he was just trying to really make people think about this. And just to add to what was said a moment ago, if you sort of think about, like, it's amazing to me that we've gotten to a point where we could actually be discussing the Ku Klux Klan in the 21st century. That's incredible. But, you know, when I saw that controversy, I thought the wrong question was asked, because the question that seemed to be asked is, why did Donald Trump take so long to repudiate them when this was raised? I think the better question is, what's in his message that it seems to appeal so much to the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists? And so I just agree with the point that it takes us into a dangerous territory, regardless of whether or not it reflects the man's true opinions. In some ways, it's actually worse if you're just exploiting this for political gain. Is
Trump's popularity giving license to all of those who, for a long time, have tried to keep their bigotry under a rock, but now maybe it's okay to bring it out into the open?
Well, you certainly hope not. You hope that American politics has not sort of evolved into that, where these sorts of things are kind of allowed. It's interesting what Darren said. The irony about the David Duke repudiation is that Donald Trump actually repudiated David Duke way back in 2000 when he was considering running for the Reform Party of the United States, Ross Perot's old outfit. And even a few days before, he had actually come out on a public podium and said, no, I don't support this man. Yet he basically stalled around for a little bit, then claimed, I don't know what white supremacy is, I don't know who David Duke is, I don't think I've ever met him, when 16 years previous, he'd actually denounced him. The problem really, unfortunately, here is, Steve, is that Trump has waited a long time for this moment. He's sort of hemmed and hawed about running for the presidency. He has picked, unfortunately, the most opportune moment to run, when all these crazy messages and all these crazy ideas resonate with an enormous core of people, including millions of new supporters who have had nothing to do with the Republican Party, and quite frankly, nothing to do with conservatives like me.
As Supriya mentioned off the top, though, that we should not sort of we shouldn't think that we're so holier than thou and that this is not a phenomenon that we don't have to deal with here in Canada, because we do. And Darren, I want to ask you how large a role Nativism played, in your view, in the defeat of the Conservative Party of Canada last October.
It didn't help. I think that much was certainly clear. It was an odd election campaign in a way that we saw a lot of these nativist sort of controversies arise in a way that we don't typically see in Canada. So there was the niqab, and then suddenly there was the weird barbaric cultural practices line. Let's take citizenship away from terrorists. And then there was the dispute about how best to handle the refugees who were coming to the country. So it sort of made a bit of a drumbeat at some point in the campaign that became very hard to ignore. And I think it did play a role because It did two things, I think. One, in Canada, we like to view ourselves, at least, as a Canadian people, as being very open, welcoming, multicultural. We don't always rise to that level, and sometimes we fall short of that in the reality and the practice. But at the very least, we like to see ourselves that way. And so, suddenly when that is so obvious, it becomes harder to ignore. And I think it just made people truly uncomfortable. And I think it also played to the narratives of the campaign. The Conservatives had always been portrayed, at least, as being quite divisive, as seeing the world in sort of us and them. And they always did seem to be at war with various constituencies. The Supreme Court, the other political parties. You can go sort of on and on with the group. The media is a big
for sure.
one. And so when suddenly nativism came in, as Priya just said, what nativism is, it really is sort of separating the world into us and them. There's the us that we look out for, there's the them that we have to be wary of. And so this played, I think, into the narrative and sort of stuck. And I think when it did that, it did crystallize opinions. So if you were against the Conservatives to begin with, this was sort of the cherry on top, where it confirmed all your thoughts anyway. And you thought, we really need a change. If you weren't there, then I think it just sort of reminded you of some of the things you didn't like, and it sort of made you think nothing's going to change. We're going to end up with more of this sort of pitch warfare here on another front, which may not really be fair, but I think it really did have an impact. And particularly when you looked across the border and you saw the craziness in the U.S. campaign,
well, let me put that
it's a
to
cautionary
Supriya.
tale.
Do you see a difference between Canadian and American nativism as played out in politics?
I do. I think the root is the same, but I think the way they play out is quite different. And, there are a myriad of reasons for that. The way our media is, we don't necessarily have as much of a bombastic 24-hour news cycle as they do in the United States. Our media isn't necessarily as divided neatly into right and left media outlets. So I think in terms of that, it just ends up playing out differently, but it's bad no matter where it is, and if the sentiment and the undercurrent is the same, and I don't think any politician, wherever they are, should be exploiting it for any sort of political gain. And what made it particularly odd, the Conservative using it in this past election, was that they needed those new Canadian and votes to be able to propel them into victory, and we saw that's how they captured much of the GTA the last time around. And to Jason Kenney, to his credit, did a lot of work making inroads with South Asian communities, and I just feel like all of that work that they've done has now been lost with this last election.
Well, Sylvia, do you want to go further? Do you want to say that the Liberal win last October is some kind of confirmation of a repudiation of nativism in the country?
We have fundamental human rights. We have ethical places ways that we should relate to each other, and we shouldn't be allowed to just disregard them because it's a campaign, because it's politics. And we collectively as society need to look at what are the norms of behavior, and people have to live with them or not. Whether they're trying to paint an image, whether they're trying to get elected, there are certain things that we cannot fan. And some of this behavior is absolutely the roots of it.
Michael, we have so far talked about the Conservative Party in Canada, the Republican Party in the United States, which may give the impression that this is a right-wing phenomenon. Is it?
No, it isn't by any means. I mean, you can look, for example, in Scandinavian countries where Muslim integration has basically been sort of blasted away by both the left and the right. This is not a conservative area. The attacks, for example, some of the violent riots that happened in Paris, France, both right and left equally attacked the groups that were there, all the disenfranchised youth, a lot of whom were either Muslims or Africans or others. It just basically became a huge explosion. Even a weirder example would be sort of Reagan Democrats or working class Democrats who actually opposed things like the Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA and various other things, which doesn't sound logical because we're talking about economic nationalism. But what do you think happens during that time? Who's coming in creating these jobs? Who are taking these jobs? What happens to the good old US of A during that time? And that's where the complexity comes in. So, yeah, it's definitely on the right. I'm not going to deny that, but it's on the left too.
Not only on the right, though.
Of course not.
Darren, the Conservative Party race, I guess, is on right now. I mean, they're not going to crown anybody for another, 15 months away still, something like that, 14, 15 months.
Speed walking in terms of a race.
Yeah, pretty much, exactly.
What should candidates who are interested in running for that job infer from all of what's happening regarding nativism on both sides of the border right now?
Well, I think a couple of things. One thing I hope they don't learn from is what Trump is doing, because it is dangerous, as has been brought up by, numerous members of the panel. That is just true. It's a dangerous thing. But if you want to be cold and calculating and Machiavellian about it, you could draw a lesson, if you were so minded, to say that nativism can work. It can generate political energy. It's an ugly thing, but as we've seen in his campaign, he's riding it, and he's riding it very effectively, apparently to the Republican nomination. If you look on our side of the border and you look at what happened in our last election campaign, and Trudeau and the way that government both ran and is governing now, they're essentially governing as an anti-nativist party, if you would. They're putting multiculturalism front and center. They're bending over backwards to make it clear that that is what Canadian society is or should be, and to give that impression. So I think what you can draw from that is it just would appear that right now there isn't fertile ground. There isn't much of an appetite for nativism in Canada at the moment. Now, that's not to say that it won't change, because it always does. But at least at the moment, it doesn't seem to have a big impact.
Well, one wonders as well, Supriya, whether or not that wave of Syrian refugees who came here, met by the Prime Minister of Canada, met by the Premier of Ontario, beautiful pictures all over the news, whether that has an impact on the level of nativism in Canada today.
I don't know if it has. I think certainly for people that were going to repudiate nativism to begin with and like the liberal message, I think they look at those pictures and it just reaffirms what they already sort of believed to begin with. But I think if you are, you are worried about the world and you worry about things like refugees secretly coming in to somehow be terrorists, even though it's completely illogical and it makes no sense. But if you do worry about that sort of thing, then you are, then you're going to look at that and say, oh, I think he's gone too far. I think this is something that is just a photo op, so I think it's just, it's what you already believed, and it's just going to reaffirm your own initial stance. But I would just like to say, I do think those kinds of gestures matter, and I think they matter how we portray ourselves to our own people and our own citizens. But I also think it matters to lead by example, and I think it was really important for the Prime Minister to be there at the airport and to lead, to show the rest of the world, Europe in particular, that we're taking a stand on this and we're going to be on the right side of history.
And that's actually a very big key, and I agree with Supriya, believe it or not. I've been on the record saying many times that the Conservative campaign, which I was not a part of in 2015, was handled very poorly in many aspects. The niqab debate, to me, was a classic example of that, where really they sort of worked on a nativist angle to try and get a few votes. And yeah, they went from 5 seats in 2011 to 10 seats in 2015, which is what they had before in the 2 previous elections. So that was seen as a bit of an accomplishment. But what really happened in the end...
in the province of Quebec.
In the province of Quebec. But we basically destroyed ourselves elsewhere. We lost a lot of new Canadian votes in Ontario. We lost them throughout Alberta. We basically got hammered really badly. And for that reason, the Liberals have actually benefited greatly from it. I think if Conservatives are going to learn anything, especially the new leader, whoever it becomes in 2017, is they have to learn that you cannot use that strategy and hope to successfully get a government in this country. Because what that really taught me, and I think it taught a lot of us, is that, yeah, it'll get you a few votes here and there, but is it really worth it? Because the big picture is you need to have support clear across the country, not just in individual provinces or not just with little teeny tiny groups.
Sure, but there are probably some New Democratic Party supporters here who are wishing that they had been a little more nativist in the province of Quebec.
Of course.
And they might not have lost so many seats.
Well, they didn't distinguish themselves between the Liberals. Certainly in the niqab debate, I think that was a big issue.
Sure, but I'm going to push back on that a little bit. I don't think Tom Mulcair and the New Democrats ran the kind of campaign that would have won them Quebec. And I know we're getting a little bit tangential here, but I just want to say, I don't think it was their position on the niqab that cost them the election. It was the fact that they didn't appeal to Quebecers. $15 a day daycare, Quebec already has their own daycare. Opening up the Constitution to abolish the Senate, no Quebecer in their right mind, aside from Pierre-Carl Pelado, was going to look forward to that sort of
But it
discussion.
dropped in their support, and that was the big issue. That issue itself was the starting point of their 20-point decline, and that's what killed them off.
Sylvia, as you look at it, the new potential Canadians who are coming in from Syria, how much of the culture of where they came from do you think they should be expected to downplay? And how much of the, whatever it means to be Canadian, do you think they need to embrace now to be fully accepted?
Well, we crossed this bridge when we had a conversation, 2 decades ago, about Sharia law, for instance, in its application. So the issue for me is, I can't go anywhere else to get my roots and my culture. It's here. But I think that all people, their basic human rights, they're basic civil rights, they're ethical things that we should do. And people within confines of good behavior are not hurting other people. And children need to be able to practice their culture the way they do. I believe, I mean, the Americans melting pot model, you know, you get to be an American something, you know, an Italian, you know, but that here people keep their identity, keep their culture, and I see those as strengths of this country, and I would hope in moving forward, whether it's the conservative leadership race or whatever it is, that we're going to talk about making sure women make up half of our governing bodies, that we're going to make sure that all of the isms have a place, and that what we do reflects the population, and that's going to be new immigrants.
Can I add to
Last word to you on this one, Darren.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And I mean, I'm a constitutional lawyer. And at the end of the day, if you live in a free and democratic society, what it means essentially, when you strip all of the jargon away, is that you can choose to live any way that you want to in this society, so long as you don't harm anyone else. And that has got to be the line. So in terms of people needing to sand down or to change their cultural practices, until it attains the level where it actually harms someone, then there really isn't a place that our society should require those kind of changes. I mean, the way that you live your life is not contingent on the way that I feel about it. You don't have to live your life in a way to make me comfortable, right? Because I don't own you. You don't own me.
Except that if Donald Trump does become president, there's going to be an expectation that these newcomers, what's the expression, fall into line?
Well, I mean, I think if we're going to be holding Donald Trump up as a standard, I think there's a problem in and of itself. So there may well be that. But the fact is, I think fundamentally that is an anti sort of, it's not anti-democratic so much as it is anti-constitutional. There are certain values we've enshrined. But those values, we know where they are. We know where the lines are. There can be gray areas, and it can be difficult to say what that is. But essentially what it boils down to is, if you're not harming anyone, live the way that you choose to live. And who's to say what is Canadian? What I think is Canadian is that we live in a free and democratic society where that you can do that. You can't do that in a dictatorship. You can't do that in a theocracy. That is a strength in our system. And so that, I think, is the way that we sometimes need to look at these things.
I think everybody would sign on to that definition of what Canadian is. That sounds like a good one. And with that, I want to thank everybody for coming into TVO tonight for this discussion. Michael Taub and Sylvia Miracle on my left, geographically, not necessarily politically, and Darren Thorne and Supriya Dwivedi on the right, geographically and not necessarily politically. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.